here. Again, my name is Ben. We're excited to have this conversation, and I think at the end we'll have a little bit of room for questions as well. Just to start, Dominique, maybe you can just tell us, like, what is Limbo Accra?
Yeah, Limbo is essentially a spatial design practice that I co-founded with my partner Emil Grip in 2018. And essentially what we do is operate within these contemporary ruins, unfinished building projects and so forth, hence the name Limbo, being that they're in this in-between state. And for some folks, you know, when they see an uncompleted building project, they see it as a point of failure. And for us, we see it as a point of inspiration and sites of potential. The practice originated in Ghana, West Africa. That's where my family comes from. So at a very young age, I always knew that I wanted to contribute to the socioeconomic development of the continent and specifically my country, and wanting to contribute to its growth and so forth. And yeah, while I was there, I couldn't help but notice that, you know, efforts towards development were really ushered by a lot of speculative real estate practices. And so in the event of that kind of production over the past couple of years, the city of Accra and the country of Ghana at large is made up of 20% of uncompleted building projects. So that's a lot of potential, let's say, in the built landscape. And for us, we saw it as an opportunity to utilize those existing resources and find new ways of transforming them. So yeah, the project originated in 2018, and we've been able to execute projects in other unfinished building projects, as you can see on a monitor here, from the UAE into the Caribbean and so forth, and yeah.
Great, and then I know that it was kind of nomadic for a bit, like you said, moving around, but then excitingly, last year you opened the Limbo Museum. What made you decide to kind of settle in a particular place, and can you tell us a little bit about what that looks like?
Yeah, so you know, over the past couple of years, embarking on this project, we've, you know, not only have done beautiful activations as such, but we've done a lot of research in terms of being able to document the amount of building stock that exists in this state on the African continent. You know, oftentimes when people think of Africa's built landscape, they think of it as a place of scarcity, right? That there's nothing there and that there's this need to build new and improved structures. But in reality, we do have sites and we do have spaces. They're either just abandoned or in a state of decay and so forth that needs an orientation of care. And so since 2022, my partner and I have been building Africa's first digital archive, which is a repository to be able to account for these building sites. And the way we've been doing so is through the technique of photogrammetry. So scanning, you know, the entire exterior of these buildings and creating 3D replicas. And through that archive, we received an invitation to institutionalize our practice. And from that point on, we felt that there was a necessity to create an institution out of Limbo, and that's how the museum emerged, in a way where there was a need to create a physical site to be able to house all of this research that we're doing and all of the potential that exists within this space. And so the building exists in the center of Accra. It's been sitting in an uncompleted state for almost 15 years. It's a private residential property, as many of these projects. And it takes up 600 square meters of, you know, concrete voided space, and
After having archived so many buildings, why is it that was the one that you landed on? Was it just a happy coincidence, or was that like something about that building that made you want to choose it?
Yeah, we've been working with that specific site for over the past couple of years, 2 years, and we've developed a unique partnership with the property owner, which is really exciting in terms of ensuring that, you know, this is not just an undertaking by ourselves, but it's in collaboration with the owners of these buildings. You know, every uncompleted or abandoned building has an owner. You know, it's not just sitting there completely unattended. So we are very mindful in those kind of in those partnerships in terms of ensuring the success of the space. And yeah, the site for us felt really organic. You know, a lot of these uncompleted buildings range from different typologies, right? Whether it's private residential, commercial real estate, governmental or religious sites. And so the scale of these structures can be even inhumane to some extent. And so for the museum, it felt very human and felt very sizable for us to operate out of.
I know you've referred before to like the unfinished building kind of as a typology within itself. Could you talk a little bit about maybe, you know, if you think about different typologies, right, residential you're living in, but then the unfinished building, kind of what does it do? Like what is that standing for you in terms of some of the places you're working with, right? Like what does it represent in terms of the built environment?
From a West African perspective, it represents a lot, right? And as I mentioned, you know, there's a lot of efforts towards development. There's a lot of efforts towards modernization on that part of the world and just largely in the global south. And so a lot of the formats for building is through these ruins. You know, people take time to build. You know, it's not like Western spaces where you have a project budget and you're most likely to complete that in 2 to 3 years, 3 to 5 years. And in cases like Africa or even South America, Central America, and so forth, there's an incremental building process there where then these structures exist in these incomplete states for 10 years, 15 years, and so forth. So that is the reality of these urban landscapes, right? And so I think it's interesting in terms of seeing them not as just this incomplete state, but the physical structures that make up the society, right? So how can we intervene within them in beneficial ways?
Yeah, because they're ubiquitous, right? I think in a lot of countries that would be considered developing or, you know, like you said, kind of creating this dichotomy between, you know, global north and then some of these places where they're everywhere, I think, you know, these buildings. And so it's interesting, right, that it's purely a perspective shift in some ways, right? And that is so important for what you're doing. Just, you know, I talk a lot about how, you know, value shifts in architecture are one of the hardest things to do, right? It moves so slow. We have such these like preconceived notions. One thing that's interesting to me, you mentioned you worked with the owners, with the community and stuff, and I think that even people probably living in some of these communities have oftentimes negative feelings about these buildings, right? Because they're incomplete. They sometimes maybe represent a sort of failure or just like a sort of, you know, lack of organization. All these connotations, right? Do you feel like you have to do quite a bit of work to kind of get people past that point? And how do you engage with people to try to, you know, with the installations, obviously, but then maybe from an outreach perspective, try to get people to kind of reconceptualize these buildings?
Yeah, I mean, that's the journey, right? It's really a learning process in terms of allowing people to understand that there's potential within their own built environment. And, you know, oftentimes it's a slow process, to be very honest, to inform one in shifting that perspective. But in the end, you know, it's always a beautiful reminder that the work that we're doing is real. Because oftentimes, you know, whether it's a property owner or whether it's a community member, you know, we're constantly getting bombarded with new requests and new asks to do this and to do that there's this other property here and that there's this other opportunity here and so forth. And so regardless, you know, it's just a matter of demonstrating the act for people to then be able to see, you know, its intended result and its impact, let's say. But yeah, it's an education process, you know. And in this image specifically, you can see that there's a completed building literally across the street from it. And so it's really just about reprogramming folks' perception of what development looks like in Africa, you know, or just in generally, you know, it's not this rush towards Western modernization, let's say, but what does it mean for ourselves in terms of how we're building and how we're building in sustainable ways that doesn't impact our resources, right? These concrete structures are, you know, sitting there in this voided state, but they don't just emerge out of anywhere, right? Their materials were extracted from some source, right? And so that has an impact on the land. And if that is affected and the urban environment it's affected, you know, it's just this, yeah.
That they're there, right? Like, and just sitting there and being like, oh, someday we'll use that, kind of ignores the spatial reality of, no, we're going to use this right now.
Correct.
Yeah, that's amazing. I really, the speculative nature of the project is super impressive, and I think a lot of people are more and more thinking like this. And I know that this came out of your own education and schooling process. And I was hoping you could talk a little bit about how you kind of took it from the theoretical like thesis into the real world. Like, what did that process look like? Because I know a lot of people here. I spoke with some people today, or working on other conceptual projects, and sometimes it can seem pretty daunting. So could you tell us a little bit about that journey?
Yeah, I mean, this was the first site ever that we worked in 2018. I was a graduate student at Lund University in Sweden, and I was actually studying international development and management. So as I mentioned, I come from more of a development background. And so I was very much interested in understanding the development of African cities through the lens of what already exists and what people were building for themselves, as opposed to, outside influences, let's say. And so casually, my partner and I, who I co-founded the studio with while we were there doing research for our master thesis, just couldn't help but notice these sites, as I mentioned. And we just thought it would be unique to find ways of activating them as a new form of public space. And so we hosted a 24 activation in November of 2018, and that was the genesis of Limbo Accra. We called the exhibition Adringano Activation Limbo Accra, and that really set the precedence to what we're doing now. And it's been incredible to see how that thesis project has now evolved into my actual practice, professional practice, and that, from a thesis process, you're able to then institutionalize, your ideas and your visions about how the world should exist as, or how the world can exist as. And it's been empowering, in that sense, because of course I don't come from an architectural background, but yet I'm able to operate within this space and be able to impact and create change in ways that are not in the traditional canon of practicing. And so for any of you students out there, definitely I encourage you to also think through, those realms of possibilities that extend beyond, the academic setting and seeing its implementation in the real world.
Well, part of that was, though, that you just went out and did it, right? And you picked a site and you kind of practiced, which I think, you were talking about how, you noticed that there were the specific opportunities right there. So it really also required you to, get out there and, find, where the interventions could happen, right? Because, I think we were talking about yesterday how, we live in New York and it's almost impossible to do stuff like this sometimes, right? But there are definitely places that are, very, ready. But do you think that, how much did your, I guess, you mentioned wanting to work in Accra for a while, do you think that was essential, having this kind of deep connection to this place in order to choose that as the point of practice?
Yeah, and one thing I'm realizing that in life, things, as you get older, things pop up in interesting ways. And, being that as a child, I always knew that I wanted to contribute to the development of the country. I didn't know how that was going to manifest, and this is the form that it's taking, and so, I feel like within this design world or within this architectural practice, it's really also just about staying true to what you feel is right and to what is right in terms of designing for a better future. And it will guide you, it will bring you there.
Have you ever been planning one of these exhibitions and then construction starts up again or something, and you have to do it? Or what are some of the pitfalls of working with some of these spaces? I assume too, some of these things aren't done as well, right? So you probably have some understanding now of construction sites and what these buildings can do, right?
Yeah, no, we haven't run into that issue yet, that a building is gonna, knock on wood. No, I mean, oftentimes these buildings end up in this state due to lack of funding, right? So for anyone to then get that construction budget back up again requires time, and so that allows us time in this transitional space to be able to then program it in this in-between moment. But if construction resumes, then that's great. Either way, it's a space that will be occupied and used. And, our mission is just to promote that while it's in this in-between state, how can we utilize it? How can we regenerate it? And how can it have some positive impact within our built environment?
Amazing, thank you. I want to talk a little bit about, obviously this is a super collaborative practice, and with the first one that you did, you also became a curator, right? Kind of bringing in people. How do you work with maybe arts organizations or locals in order to pick what is going, and in some of them you have installation, sculpture, and some you have more kind of large-scale textile stuff and then kind of more fine arts. So how does that process look like?
I mean, it all depends on the site, right? Each site holds its own story. Each site holds its own context and its complexities. And so within that, you design from the condition, let's say. I mean, with this is a museum itself in its current state. And the way we chose to inaugurate the museum in November of last year was with no exhibition, with no presentation of work and anything of that nature, truly to inaugurate the shell as is and bring folks together both internationally and locally to really just come together in dialogue and in conversation to discuss the potential of this new format of institutional building within these ruins and within these sites. And it was a powerful coalescence of individuals in terms of speaking to these ideas. But in the way we're setting up our curatorial exhibition program for the museum is really to invite not just artists, but researchers, thinkers, practitioners, everyone and anyone under the realm of looking at recycling already existing materials, right? There's no new form of production in this space. There's no need to extract, greater resources to produce any, engagements or programs within here. And the idea is for the works to really live within the shell and respond to the canvas as is. One of our core philosophies for the museum, especially since we're not a traditional museum space that has windows and doors and so forth, this site is subjected to the natural conditions of the world. And so we're also encouraging folks to also consider their work to disintegrate within this space and overlap and change with time and change with the elements that is charged within these properties and so forth. And so it's really, the museum is set up to be a lab. It's set up to be an interdisciplinary experimental space where, there's ways to test new formats of production within it.
So you mentioned that you kind of came from outside of the architecture field in terms of education, but then I think that some of the people who are engaging a lot with your work are people who are working on the built environment. What has been some of the reactions that you've gotten to from architects, and is there anyone kind of that you, like, have any collaborations been born through that of the built environment or urban design since you've been working on this?
Yeah, no, it's been really impressive, to be honest, to not have been formally trained as an architect. The reception that we've received has been really, really incredible from just the global architectural community, the different spaces we get invited to, such as SCAD here, to be able to share our mission and our projects. It's really impressive, and it just shows the work that we're doing is real, and that we're addressing real issues, not just in Africa, but truly across our world, right? Our entire planet is littered with ruins, whether it's ancient sites in Cambodia to contemporary building projects in Ghana, whatever the case is. There's spaces that, needs attention and needs care and needs some type of stewardship, and it's important that we as humans and as people, take that responsibility and empower ourselves and empower our community and empower our peers to be able to impact change in real positive ways. And just do it. You know what I mean? I think that's what's been inspiring here is that, the field of architecture may feel so intimidating to folks, but, we all engage with architecture in one way or another. We all sleep in a home. We all walk into a storefront. We all engage within these buildings and whatnot. So I think every single individual has an opportunity to engage and make change through this field that we're in.
So you mentioned like ancient ruins, which I think that are kind of formally represent a different part of our imaginary than a brutalist ruin. And some people talk about, kind of like failures of modernity and sort of how this kind of weird time conceptualization, right? That these buildings aren't done yet, but they still kind of do represent maybe like a future that didn't happen or like a past that wasn't fully fulfilled. So I guess that how do you kind of conceptualize, like brutalism or modernism, like in these spaces in West Africa and as a ruin, right? Opposed to maybe like a Cambodian ruin or something that's more ancient, right? What's that dichotomy?
I think, again, it comes down to perspective, right? And when I'm speaking of like an ancient ruin from thousands of years ago, it's more so to orient ourselves towards this idea of stewardship and care and preservation and ensuring that, you know, we're not being extractive towards our spaces and sites and whatnot. And so within the case of a contemporary ruin context in West Africa, yeah, it speaks to a lot of the brutalist aesthetics and so forth, and especially the ideals from Le Corbusier. You know, we're celebrating 100 years of his famous text Towards a New Architecture, in which he really put out these, you know, radical notions of building with prefab concrete structures and so forth. And that's what we see in most of Africa today, you know, those same ideals. And so, you know, I think it's just interesting in terms of being able to align our practice to those, I guess, traditional aesthetics and periods within architecture, and then seeing how that plays out in a 2025 context in Africa today, right? And again, I'm really just about this juxtaposition between what the image of African architecture, the built landscape looks like, where it's usually positioned as either traditional or vernacular forms of architecture, or super modern project designed and built by David Adjaye or Francis Curie or so forth, right? But in that in-between, the reality are these concrete structures, right? These contemporary ruins and whatnot. So it offers itself a new aesthetic, a new language, you know, and a new reality that one must contest with.
And it's quite hopeful too, because if you do kind of think about maybe some of the failures of the modern project, like as it spread, like as it was, you know, recontextualized, right? Like this is kind of in me saying that like maybe there are some like hiccups, but like it's still going, right? Like, and this is, you're activating it, right? Like there's still life within these, but it maybe doesn't have to always be perfect or programmed. So maybe, you know, so I guess then there's a lot within that imperfection, and it seems like you guys are really...
It's just about spreading awareness, you know, spreading awareness, like, you know, the same way we chose to inaugurate this space with nothing. It's just to bring awareness that these sites exist, you know, that there's an opportunity to change our orientation and our practices within architecture and building in general. You know, the West is the North Star for a lot of these countries in the global South. So there's this responsibility to ensure that we're not gonna find ourselves in the same position we're finding the city of New York in Accra, which is a city that's just now being built and so forth. And so it's really what the practice, as much as it's a design and whatnot practice, it's also like an educational practice and bringing awareness to folks that, you know, there's these spaces that can be revitalized, regenerated, and transformed.
Amazing. I was hoping we'd talk a little bit about this project specifically. How did that come about? Because this is in Saudi Arabia?
Sharjah, in the UAE.
Yeah, in the UAE, and obviously a bit of a different context, but maybe you could tell us a little bit about how that project got started and then why you chose the specific sort of intervention with the flowing weave work.
Yeah, so we were invited by the Sharjah Architecture Triennale to participate in the Triennale program in 2023, and of course, you know, this was our first international invitation to partake in a building as such. And so, obviously, when we first arrived in Sharjah, our first question was, where are the unfinished buildings? You know, before you get to Sharjah, you arrive in Dubai, and I'm not sure if you guys have been to the UAE, you can understand the kind of development that exists there, where it's really just this fast, modern, shiny, these shiny structures. And so I wanted to peek and see what is unfinished within this finished landscape. And to our surprise, when we first arrived, you know, most of the Triennale team kept telling us that there were no unfinished buildings in Sharjah, that they kept taking us to more abandoned sites. And, you know, for us, there's a difference between abandoned and unfinished. Abandoned buildings had a life of, you know, occupancy. Folks were able to operate within the space, and then it's been left abandoned, whereas an incomplete and unfinished state has never reached a form of completion at all, right? So it's really still sitting in this state. And so after a few days in Sharjah, we came across this site, which happens to be the Sharjah Mall, which is about 5 New York City blocks. over 600,000 square meters. A really massive site, and actually the largest building project in that emirate of Sharjah. And it's been sitting there uncompleted for 15 years, which is not common for the emirate, hence their first reaction that no, we don't have any unfinished structures. But, of course, with any building project, one hits a roadblock. But we thought that it would be interesting to connect our practice, obviously, from West Africa to the Middle East, and see what kind of relationships we can form and weave through these two different continents. And so, that's how the textile installation really came about, in terms of us really wanting to create an intervention that was really about this weaving and this storytelling of our practice in West Africa and how it relates to this context in the UAE, and really speak to these buildings in transition, right? The reason why we worked with this fabric is because we couldn't also help but notice that as much as the UAE is almost finished in its development, there's still a lot of ongoing construction projects, and when those construction projects are in the process of getting built, they're constantly draped with these construction fabrics and nettings and so forth. And so we really wanted to work with that aesthetic of transition within building, and find ways of weaving, these points. And so,
I'm really interested too in the point you just made about sort of the abandoned versus the unfinished. Would you kind of consider ever kind of moving into the space of, because I know that probably in North America there probably are more abandoned structures, and I think especially in some cities that have been kind of vacated or like changing economies, right? Do you think that that's a potential for the practice of engaging with, or you? Oh
yeah, of course. I mean, right now they kind of work in the same breath, but we also like to, make a clear distinction. Yeah. So, even in our archive that we're building, a lot of the ruins are abandoned building projects as well. They're kind of like one and the same. I mean, there's a project that was shown here in the Cayman, in the Caribbean, where that was an abandoned hotel, where we were invited to intervene within, and they wanted us to intervene within the shell of the building, but we thought to work with the landscape instead, and really, not only revitalize the building shell itself, but also look at the landscape, right? Also understand where the land to which these buildings are situated on, and what can also arrive from that connection and dealing with the ecology of the building outside of its concrete, material. So
how do you think about these ecologies? Because I think that, a lot of people, they look at these sites and, they're bulldozed, and then kind of there was construction site, and then a lot of it's, kind of weeds, or like people think it's not super landscape usually. And I noticed that some of your projects, you kind of leave it be a little bit, but what are some of the interventions that you do make? And then maybe you could also talk a little bit about the aluminum installation that you did in Cayman.
Yeah, no, I think we cannot, not recognize, the natural environment when we're dealing within these ruins, because, they're the primary occupant at this point, these non-human entities. And they're like, we must also respect, their consideration. And I say this because a lot of the developments that I do see in my city, Accra, completely negates that. When a contractor has been appointed to build a project, the first thing they're going to say, and you can see in the case here, especially for this building up there, they will ask you if you've completely cleared the land. And by saying that is very alarming, meaning that have you stripped the land of any vegetation or anything so that we can build anew? And so what you see in Accra and in a lot of these spaces when the projects are finished are, a lot of these tiled surfaces. And
this is the Cayman one here. Right?
Yeah, this is the Cayman project, by the way. But anyways, I'm saying that to say, there's a lack of attitude towards preserving nature and ensuring that we really build in truly sustainable ways, where we're not having to, constantly ensure that our buildings are suffocated with ACs, because that's the way we put up our structure, and that we can allow for exterior, interior conditions within it.
I don't think ACs would be doing much for these buildings, but...
In Ghana, yeah.
Well, no, I mean for the unfinished ones.
Yeah, no, but more so in the finished context. But yeah, for the project here in Cayman, it was really, really inspiring to not look at the building, but really much so have the building frame our intervention, let's say, and be the backdrop to how we engage with the land to which the site is situated on, you know. The property is abandoned in its entirety. It's not just the building, it's also the landscape. So how do we draw our attention into ensuring that there's some kind of symbiosis between, you know, the barren structure that can exist as is, and then this newly created landscape that folks can then enjoy and have as a moment of respite and truly a space of reflection, you know, in terms of the carving of these new possibilities.
So are these aluminum poles then kind of meant to orient perception? Is that what you were
Correct.
thinking?
Yeah, to reflect and to create moments of contemplation and really just allow itself to blend within the landscape, right? For it to not be so imposing. Yeah. So
I know that you're in New York most of the time, and then going back and forth, and I'm constantly impressed by you because you also, you know, you're doing what it takes to live in New York, and you know, just the hustle all the time. How do you manage kind of the back and forth, or like kind of working across continents, and what are some ways that you make that more efficient, or kind of obviously it can be difficult to work over such a large variety with teams in Accra. So how do you manage that just on a personal level?
No, it's empowering, to be very honest, you know, because the work that I do, I'm not only trying to situate it as like an African-centered project, I really want to situate it as a global platform for anyone and everyone around the world to engage with, you know. I feel like the way the world is orienting right now, that like we can't isolate ourselves in our productions anymore, and so I feel like there's this real need to collaborate beyond borders. And so by being able to position myself between New York and Accra, I'm able to engage with a disarray of folks, you know, and really create new opportunities and partnerships for, you know, creative exchange, institutional exchange, academic exchanges, and so forth. And so, yeah, we're really trying to create a new format for institutional building here, and it doesn't just exist in the city of Accra, you know. It exists in our partnerships around the world, whether that's in the Middle East or in Europe, in Denmark or in New York or wherever the case is, you know. We're really trying to create a global alliance towards how do we respond to these ruins.
What does your team look like then, who are between the museum and the platform? Do you have a kind of a bunch of the same collaborators all the time, or is it kind of changing with each new venture?
It's more or less the same collaborators. We're very open studio, and you know, depending on the project or the brief that we receive, the makeup of the team changes in that sense. But we're small and mighty, I would say. My team consists of folks in New York, but also folks in Europe, as I mentioned, between Germany and Denmark, and then as well as folks on the ground in Accra. And we all seem to manage. We all seem to play our own parts and make sure that the work that we're doing exists.
I'm curious because, you know, you're obviously perception changing, but then also having art installations or bringing people to these sites. And, you know, I'm not sure if all of them are, because it seems like some of them are in fully finished neighborhoods, right? So I wouldn't necessarily, it's like a whole community of abandoned buildings or something. But have you noticed any sort of, you know, environmental or like economic boost or something, or kind of like, you know, do you ever think about these projects as a way to sort of like bring more business to an area, bring more people to an area, or kind of like change like beyond just the site itself, kind of a community on a community level?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that you say that, and I was actually speaking to one of the students during the portfolio review about this, but we're really inspired by the idea of urban acupuncture and this idea of, you know, I'm sure you're familiar with traditional acupuncture in terms of like healing the body at certain points and applying that on an urban scale and seeing how you can intervene within specific sites and seeing how that then triggers and impacts neighborhoods and you know, and has more of an authentic and organic regeneration, let's say, in that format. And so we kind of oppose the idea of master planning, but more so specifically working in site-specific locations that can then offer its own healing, let's say, through its activation. So that's our approach.
Have you seen that kind of play out?
I would say in Accra, yes, because there is definitely a shift towards folks, you know, just using different kind of spaces to activate, whether it's barren, whether it's half built and so forth, you know, especially within some of the new firms that are emerging in Ghana. A lot of firms are now also looking towards this adaptive reuse of building projects, which is obviously inspired by the work that we've been doing, because prior to that, no one would ever touch an uncompleted building in Ghana, because it would be really a point of failure. And so it's really interesting in seeing that this new generation of architects, even in Ghana, are taking up these projects where they're actually, completing them, beyond our artistic interventions.
And then it is a global platform too. So do you notice maybe more kind of international attention, or like kind of, having art projects here? Do you notice more people kind of focusing on these areas or coming into it, or do you find that most of the people who are engaging with these projects are more local?
It's everything, both international and local. So right now, actually, I should be in Ghana, but I'm here with you all. We're currently doing an undertaking in partnership with the first university built in Ghana called the Kwame Nkrumah University. And essentially what we're doing is embarking on a 3-year teaching lab called the Limbo Architecture Lab, which also includes a partnership with the AA Visiting School in London, where we bring both local and international students to prepare a specific site. So it's one of the 2 tracks that exist at the museum, obviously our traditional exhibition program and then our teaching lab. But the teaching lab doesn't necessarily take place at the museum. Our goal is also to decentralize the institutional's operation, to showcase that these ruins exist in an abundance. And so not everything needs to just take place here. And so we're working with a building at that university, which was a former presidential library that didn't get the chance of completion. And so essentially what we're doing right now as we speak is creating new biotextile materials in collaboration with a Danish artist that we invited, the Danish biotextile artist, Bonnie Vilum. She's the founder of Natural Materials Studios. Yeah, Bonnie, yeah. She's in Accra, her team right now. And so essentially we're really trying to find new ways of, stretching her material and seeing how it can be applied as a new building material to repair these buildings. So right now, her team and my team are within this ruin and basically testing out the creation of these new textiles with either agricultural waste, industrialized waste, and so forth. So yeah.
So it's been going a couple of years now, and I mean, I've been hearing about it for a while, and I think that a lot of people are really excited about it. Has anyone come to you and be like, "Hey, Dominique, like I'm really trying to do this where I'm at, and want to work with you on that level"? I know you mentioned that you might be doing some stuff in East Asia or Southeast Asia, and is that something that you're willing to work on with people? Like,
of course. Like the goal is to empower everyone and anyone to take up this practice. We're constantly receiving requests from Cape Verde to Cairo to Angola, to Bangkok with the new Bangkok Kansala, and just around the world, folks that are really orienting themselves towards the reuse of spaces. And we're seeing that we're becoming a voice to support others in that effort.
Is there any one right now that you've seen that you're super excited about as far as someone taking up this work? I mean, I think that, and also maybe do you find that there's other people who have maybe kind of been doing the work and quietly, and they kind of see that you've like really managed to find a way to project it and kind of get some momentum and are excited?
Yeah, I will give a shout out to the Incomputu team in Sicily. They essentially back in the early 2000s created a repository for uncompleted buildings in Italy, specifically in Sicily. And they've just been doing that work and have continued to do that work in terms of like trying to find new ways of reimagining. And I didn't come across their work until a bit later in my practice, and I had the opportunity to meet their team in Milan last year, or at least a member from their team, and we're actually working on a project with Bonnie later this year in Sicily in November. So it's hard to like pinpoint a specific example, but there's just a constant flow of conversation across actors around the world that are working with these sites that we're engaged with. And I mean, I can list a few projects such as what's happening in Uzbekistan with Tashkent modernism and how they're looking at preserving their, modernist structures. Of course, the work that Hor Al-Qasimi is doing in Sharjah, hence, why our invitation was why we participated, again, Bangkok, our guys in New York, with SAA and WSA and transforming these, abandoned buildings. Yeah, there's just a constellation of folks doing things
Like
within
you said,
these sites.
once you kind of get onto this work, it's kind of build momentum. And I think you've done a really good job at sort of packaging it for people too, right? That maybe they're not in Accra, but like they're understanding the project. Like I think that you, and I know that you also have a background in doing some communication stuff too. And I guess I wonder then, you know, beyond like being on the ground, how do you conceptualize like projecting this from, I know you have a digital archive, but what are some strategies that you use to really kind of make this a global platform?
Foster collaboration. You know, the way my partner and I created this practice was not to be the sole prescriber of what these spaces should exist as. You know, we want to leave it up to the public. I mean, the way we understand these spaces, as we understand them as new formats for public space. So that can't just be a decision made by myself or my partner. That needs to involve a collective effort of so many individuals. And so, you know, in order for us to be able to communicate that and ensure that we have to open our doors, we have to speak to individuals and invite them in and establish new partnerships and new relationships and new exchanges. You know, the work can't just be done alone by us. And yeah.
Do you imagine then that it's interesting to me. I think that, you know, a lot of people I talk to about sustainable solutions and architecture, and not a lot of people want to hear this, I think, but like part of the thing is reusing stuff. Do you imagine ever, you know, I understand the limbo part is important, but do you ever plan on using the platform, the momentum, maybe to finish some stuff, or like kind of create habitable things, and what will that look like?
Of course. Well, that's what we're doing with the teaching lab in partnership with KNUST and the visiting school, is to complete this building project. So the teaching lab is an exercise to the completion of this unfinished presidential library. So that will be one of our first testaments towards that. And again, you know, we didn't want to just do this as like an individual practice base. We wanted to do it in an institutional collaborative format to showcase its potential and showcase that the different actors that can get involved in the completion of a building.
The potential can bring us forward, right?
Yeah.
And become new things. And amazing. Well, I'm getting the signal here that we're at the end. We're going to have some questions, but do you have any kind of last thoughts or words of encouragement maybe for people who are trying to do similar work?
Yeah, I would just say follow your gut. To be honest, trust yourself, especially, you know, this new generation. We're living in very interesting times where we have access to a lot of things. And so I would just encourage you to not feel ever intimidated by anything or anyone, and just like trust yourself. You know, that's what we need in this world, especially if we really want to create real change. So that's all.
Let's hear it for Dominique. I know we have time for a couple questions. I think there's a mic runner.
Oh, is this on? Oh, I'm actually in the sneaker design program, but I have a nonprofit called Urban Rivers. We build floating river parks. What are some of the pitfalls you've experienced from all this inbound on building that community? Because it's a growing pain we're facing, but it's exciting. But I'm still treading cautiously how to like bring all these people together, because it's such diverse cultures that are wanting to do a practice that we've done. So I'm just wondering, what have you learned from that experience in building that international community and the specific niche that you're building?
Yeah, well, I think you mentioned it, this idea of being cautious, right? I think the work that we're doing requires time, and that's something that we're very keen on, ensuring that, you know, we're doing this with intention, and we're also taking our time here. You know, we're not rushing to some end goal or anything of that nature. So I think really just being intentional and ensuring that the work that you're doing is in alignment with your vision and with the context to which is seeking this request, let's say, is really all that matters. And at the end of the day, everything is a conversation, right, before it gets implemented and gets into action. So I think you also can find a lot of your resolution in that dialogue, right? And it's not a one-way dialogue, right, that can be replicated, but yeah.
Thank you for the question. Any more from the audience here? Let's try to...
So this kind of plays on the idea of private property and the idea of capitalism, and I was curious if the spaces we occupy are limited to the curation of the museum, or if the people outside of that can kind of interact. Because one of my most interesting things, in my opinion, with urban decay is how people with like graffiti and kind of this idea of tagging and how we use abandoned spaces, of what form of interaction is it limited to, is what I'm trying to. That was poorly worded, but I hope.
So are you asking if there's like some public interaction as well?
Yeah, like are the museums limited by interaction through monetary means, or are they open spaces where works can be kind of interacted with besides that?
Correct, exactly. So, as I mentioned earlier, our goal is to really demarcate these private spaces as a new format for public space that can be accessible and that can be approachable. And so that's the goal, right? The goal is to ensure that this really truly exists as a format of public space, like any park, right? Instead of seeing it as this uncompleted building, see it as a park, see it as, a recreational space or something of that nature that can then allow for the public to engage. So we're all about community integration. We're all about ensuring that, folks across generation has access, to the work that we're doing. So, yeah.
I love that idea of shifting the perspective of private itself, too, kind of blurring the lines. Amazing. You have a couple more over here.
Hi, my name's Lily. I'm a fibers major. I was wondering if you get to talk to a lot of different people across all your adventures and places that you go to do this. Does art act as like a universal language between all these different cultures, and how does that help bridge differences between all these different people that you're putting in a group?
No, that's a really good question. Yeah, we, especially with our first activation in 2018, while I was a student, I saw art as like a soft power tool to be able to communicate these ideas and the research that I was doing into these unfinished structures. And so art has been a conduit, to be able to activate these spaces, at least in these soft ways, and it's been able to allow us to, present works that is not just ours, but others in these spaces. So, yeah.
We'll take a last question over here.
Okay. Hello, I'm Sam. I'm a fibers major. I was wondering of how you technically can find these spaces and integrate into them, and if you intuitively, from these spaces, intuitively create your works or have artists create their works from viewing the spaces, or the artists just create the works and then you integrate the works in the spaces afterwards.
Yeah, for us, it's all about just observation, right? We're really keen on touring cities and seeing what buildings exist in this state. So that's really our process. It's very organic in that sense of just, having to take the time to drive around or walk around a certain place to have these buildings be revealed to you, let's say. That was the instance of our first exhibition. But with obviously commissions like this one and with the Sharjah Architecture Triennale, these are sites that were kind of brought to us. But for the most part, we're very much about being on the ground and letting these buildings reveal themselves to us. We're also very keen on ensuring that folks that reach out to us and wanting to do activations within Limbo, that we also give them a tool of empowerment to find buildings on their own, in their neighborhood, that it's obviously in closer proximity to them to be able to do the work that they want to do and not necessarily having to centralize it in our headquarters, right? Our goal is to decentralize the practice and decentralize the mission and activate as much ruins as possible simultaneously.
Thank you.
Great. Well, let's have one more round of applause for Dominique.